The first sign that something had changed came not from any sensor array or monitoring station, but from the Lumenari priest-navigator Soravon, who was charting a routine course through the Veth Nebula when she simply fell out of her chair. She did not trip. She did not faint from illness. One moment she was standing at her navigation console, tracing the luminous filaments of ionized gas with her photoreceptive tendrils, and the next moment every conscious thought she had ever possessed was compressed into a single point of absolute silence, and then expanded outward into something so incomprehensibly vast that her nervous system simply surrendered. When she woke 6 hours later on the floor of her ship, her tendrils had changed color permanently, from their natural silver blue to a deep, pulsing gold that no Lumenari physician had ever recorded in any living being. She could not explain what she had experienced. She could only say, in a voice that trembled not from fear but from the inadequacy of language, that she had felt the Aurethis breathe. The Aurethis, that was what the Lumenari called it. The breathing light, the oldest name in their oldest texts, predating their first cities, predating written language, predating even the crude astronomical instruments with which their distant ancestors had first looked at the galactic center and felt something looking back. The Lumenari had built cathedrals of living crystal that resonated with the Aurethis' presence. They had trained generations of priest-navigators to feel its warmth as a guiding constant during faster-than-light transit, using it the way ancient sailors had used fixed stars, navigating not by its position, but by its emotional signature, that vast and wordless sense of something ancient and aware and utterly still. It was not still anymore. Soravon's report reached the Lumenari High Resonance Council within 40 hours, and by then the council was already overwhelmed. Reports were flooding in from every Lumenari ship and settlement within 600 light-years of the galactic center. Every priest-navigator, every spiritual sensitive, every individual who had ever been trained to feel the Aurethis had experienced the same collapse. 6 hours of unconsciousness, gold-altered tendrils, and upon waking, a sensation that none of them had words for, because the Lumenari spiritual tradition had spent 10,000 years describing the Aurethis as warmth and stillness and benevolent presence, and their vocabulary had simply never needed a word for what they were now feeling emanating from that ancient, vast, awakened thing. The closest approximation their language offered was a word used in hunting contexts, the specific feeling of being watched by something that has not yet decided whether you are prey. 300 light-years away, in a very different kind of council chamber, the Vorak Supreme War Assembly was engaged in a very different kind of crisis. The Vorak did not have priest-navigators. They did not have cathedrals of resonant crystal. They had what they had always had: weapons, warships, and the unshakable conviction that the universe was a hierarchy of predators and prey, and that the only meaningful question in any situation was which category you currently occupied. They had worshipped the entity they called the Kethvron, the vast silence, the unconquerable stillness, not out of love or spiritual connection, but out of something closer professional admiration. The Kethvron was, in Vorak philosophy, the ultimate predator, so absolute in its dominance that it had never needed to act, so powerful that its mere existence was sufficient. They had built their military traditions around this concept. The greatest Vorak commanders were those who could win wars without fighting them, who could project such overwhelming force that enemies surrendered before a single weapon was fired. They called the strategy Kethvron, to be so powerful that action becomes unnecessary. So when every weapon system on every Vorak warship simultaneously activated and targeted the galactic center, without any command being issued, without any authorization code being entered, without any living Vorak touching any control panel, the Supreme War Assembly did not feel spiritual awe. They felt the specific, cold, clarifying terror of a predator who has just realized his prey. Fleet Prime Dorshack convened emergency assembly within hours of the incident. She was a massive Vorak, even by the standards of her species. Six-limbed, armored in natural chitin that had been further reinforced with ablative plating, before her 8 eyes permanently modified for deep space observation. She had commanded 17 major fleet engagements and had never once, in 40 years of military service, felt afraid of anything she could see, measure, and calculate. She was afraid now. "The Kethvron has moved," she said, without preamble, without ceremony, to the assembled war commanders. "Our weapons recognized it before our instruments did. This tells us something important." She paused, letting her remaining four natural eyes sweep the room. Our weapon systems are designed to target existential threats. They have never misfired. They have never activated without authorization. The one thing they are absolutely calibrated to identify is something that could destroy us. When they targeted the galactic center, they were doing their job. The silence that followed was a particular silence of a room full of apex predators confronting the existence of something above them on the food chain. "What do we do?" asked Sub-Commander Veth, who was young enough to still believe that there was always something to do. Dorzak looked at the tactical display showing the galactic center and the slow, patient movement of something enormous beginning its journey outward to the spiral arms. "We find out what it wants," she said, "and then we decide whether we can give it something else instead." The Mirehn collective had no individual voices to fall silent, no weapon to activate without orders. The Mirehn were a distributed intelligence, not a hive mind in the simple sense, but a vast network of interconnected biological nodes, each node being a considerable individual intelligence, but the true mind of the collective existing in the connections between them, in the patterns of information that flowed through their network like thoughts through a single brain. There were approximately 400 billion individual Mirehn nodes distributed across 11 star systems, and the collective's consciousness was an emergent property of 400 billion beings thinking together. When the mathematical transmission arrived, it did not go to one node. It went to all of them simultaneously. The transmission was not sound. It was not electromagnetic radiation in any conventional sense. It was something that arrived through dimensions of Mirehn's best theoretical physicists had spent centuries arguing about whether they existed at all, and it arrived as pure mathematics. Not symbols representing mathematical concepts, but mathematics itself. The actual substrate of logical relationship manifesting directly in the information processing tissue of 400 billion minds. The effect was immediate and total. Every node in the collective began processing the transmission simultaneously. For 14 days, the Mirehn collective thought about almost nothing else, dedicating 93% of its total cognitive capacity to decoding the signal. The remaining 7% kept their civilization running. Ships flew, food was synthesized, the basic administrative functions of 11 inhabited star systems continued, but with the dazed, automatic quality of a person performing familiar tasks while their mind is somewhere else entirely. By the end of 14 days, they had decoded 4% of the transmission. The high analytical chorus, the specialized subnetwork of the collective dedicated to the most complex intellectual challenges, classified what that 4% contained at the highest possible security level. Access was restricted to the 3,000 nodes who composed the chorus itself. And even among those 3,000, there were long stretches of network silence while the invocations were processed, which for the Mirehn was the equivalent of a room full of people going completely speechless. What the 4% said, translated into sequential language for the benefit of species who process information one thought at a time, was this: the entity had been sleeping. The entity's sleep was not like the sleep of organic beings, a temporary suspension of consciousness for biological maintenance, but rather a specific state of cosmic hibernation that it entered voluntarily at intervals, for reasons that the 4% did not explain but strongly implied were connected to some cyclical process of the universe itself, something larger than galaxies, something that operated on timescales so vast that the entire current age of stellar formation was a single moment within it. The entity had been sleeping for, as near as the Mirehn could calculate from the mathematical constants embedded in the transmission, approximately 800,000 years. The warm, constant presence that 5 civilizations had built their religions around, the Aurethis, the Kethvron, and its 3 other names, had been the entity sleeping. What they had worshipped as a conscious deity was an unconscious one, and now it was awake. The 4% did not explain why it had woken. It did not explain why it was moving. It did not explain what it wanted. But embedded in the mathematical structure of those 4% were constants, values, measurements that the high analytical chorus found deeply troubling. The entity's mass was not calculable in any conventional sense. Its physical substrate, whatever that was, did not interact with gravity the way matter did, and the very act of measuring its energy output caused the measuring instruments to return values that contradicted the fundamental laws of physics in ways that should have been impossible. But from indirect measurements, from behavior of space itself around the entity as it moved, the chorus could infer certain things. The entity was not the size of a star system, as ancient religious texts from all 5 civilizations had claimed. The entity was the size of a galaxy, not the galactic center, not a region of the galaxy. The entire galaxy, the arms, the core, the halo, the dark matter structure, all of it, was in some sense at the 4% gesture at without fully explaining part of the entity's body. The warmth that 5 civilizations had felt for 10,000 years had not been emanating from the center. It had been emanating from everywhere, from the very fabric of the galaxy itself, and species had interpreted it as coming from the center simply because that was where their instruments pointed when they tried to triangulate the source of something that had no single point of origin. The Mirehn High Analytical Chorus sat with this information for a long time. Then the most senior node in the chorus, a being who had been thinking continuously for over 2,000 years, and whose individual intelligence was so refined it sometimes seemed to operate slightly ahead of events rather than behind them, transmitted a single query to the rest. If we have been living inside it all along, what does it mean that it is hungry? The Threnni had no answer for that question, but not because they had not thought of it. The Threnni were beings of pure consciousness. They had evolved beyond physical forms so many millions of years ago that their biology, if they had ever had conventional biology, was lost to history so ancient that even the Mirehn's most comprehensive archaeological analyses had never found evidence of their physical precursors. They existed as patterns of organized energy, self-sustaining field of consciousness that could travel through space at speeds that conventional physics did not permit, that could interact with physical matter when they chose to but were not bound by it, that experienced time in a non-linear fashion, that made communication with physical species an exercise in patience for all parties involved. The Threnni call the entity the Morn. The words translated, approximately, as that which is also us. They had believed for longer than any of the other 4 civilizations had existed that the entity was not separate from consciousness itself, not a being who had consciousness, but the source from which all consciousness in the galaxy derived. In Threnni philosophy, individual minds were like ripples on the surface of the Morn, and the sensation of being a separate self was a kind of useful illusion that consciousness created for purposes of experience. When the entity woke, the Threnni ceased to exist for 6 hours. They returned with no memory of where they had gone. This was, for the Threnni, the most terrifying thing that had ever happened. They were beings of pure consciousness. They had no unconscious state, no sleep, no gap in awareness. Their existence was continuous and unbroken across timescales that would seem geological to physical species. For 6 hours of objective time, there had simply been no Threnni anywhere in the universe. And then there were again, and they had no knowledge of those 6 hours whatsoever. The philosophical implications consumed them entirely for the first week. If the Threnni were ripples on the surface of the Morn, and the Morn was awake, had they been absorbed back into it? Had they been, for 6 hours, not gone but simply unindividuated, returned to the source, dissolved back into the vast consciousness they had always believed they were part of? Was that experience of dissolution what they could look forward to on a permanent basis, now that the source was awake and moving? And then the deeper question, the one that none of the Threnni spoke aloud for several days, but that all of them were thinking simultaneously, because they were beings of consciousness, and their thoughts were somewhat public among themselves. If the Morn was the source of all consciousness, and it was hungry, what did it eat? The Vaeshi did not have philosophers in the conventional sense. They did not reason their way to conclusions through chains of logical argument. They were empathic beings. Their primary mode of cognition was emotional. Their communication was a direct transmission of feeling states, and their understanding of the universe was fundamentally experiential rather than analytical. They called the entity the warmth that has always been, a name so simple it had sometimes struck the other 4 civilizations as naive, until they considered that the Vaeshi had perhaps described it more accurately than anyone. 3,000 Vaeshi died when the entity woke. The emotion they received was too large for biological systems to process. It came in through their empathic receptors like water through a valve designed for droplets, and the systems that manage emotional input simply burned out catastrophically, irreversibly. 3,000 dead in an instant, across every Vaeshi world, every Vaeshi ship, Every Vaeshi station with an emotional transmission range at the galactic center, which, for beings whose empathic sense extended far beyond what physical instruments could measure, turned out to be most of the galaxy. The emotion itself, described by the survivors as best they could, was not like any emotion in the Vaeshi experiential catalog. Vaeshi researchers spent days trying to find a classification for it, working their way through every recorded emotional state in Vaeshi history, through fictional emotional states described in their literature, through theoretical emotional states proposed by their psychologists. None fit the closest approximation, and every Vaeshi who worked on the classification problem reached this same approximation independently, which they found significant, was a feeling of waking from a very long sleep and realizing that something you urgently needed was not there, and not knowing yet what was, but feeling the absence of it as a physical ache so profound it colored every other sensation. The Vaeshi called this feeling, in their language Seravath, the untranslatable, the ache of a need so deep you do not know its name. The warmth that had always been was experiencing Seravath on a scale that the Vaeshi's most profound philosophers, their most gifted empaths, their entire species collectively, could not encompass. And it was coming closer. The first meeting of representatives from all 5 civilizations took place on a station that technically belonged to none of them, a trading post called Vethkarma, built at the intersection of 3 ancient hyperspace lanes, nominally under joint Lumenari-Mirehn administration, but practically a neutral ground where every species in this region of the galaxy came to exchange goods and information. It was not a dignified venue for what was arguably the most important diplomatic gathering in recorded history, but it was available, it was central, and none of the 5 civilizations were willing to meet on any of the others' home territory. The Lumenari delegation was led by High Resonant Se Luminar, an elder priest navigator whose tendrils had been gold for 30 years from a previous, lesser encounter with some echo of the Aurethis' presence. She moved through Vethkarma's corridors with the slow, deliberate grace of someone carrying a weight that others could not see. The Vorak sent Fleet Prime Dorzhak, because Dorzhak was the highest-ranking military commander who was also willing to sit in a room with the other 4 species without immediately cataloging their tactical weaknesses. The Mirehn sent a cluster, 17 nodes, physically separate but thinking as one, which manifested outside observers as 17 small, dense beings who occasionally finished each other's sentences or all fell silent at the same moment, and who collectively called themselves First Analytical Voice for the purposes of this meeting. The Threnni sent a representative who appeared to the others as a faint luminescence in the air, barely visible, who communicated through a translation device that converted their transmitted consciousness states into spoken language with approximately 60% accuracy, which was the best any translation technology had ever achieved for beings who thought in feelings rather than words. The Vaeshi sent their high empath speaker, Ko Seravath, who had been named after the untranslatable feeling at her hatching, because her parents had had some kind of premonitory sense, or so the Vaeshi press was now saying. She was the only member of her delegation. The Vaeshi had learned, from the deaths of 3,000, that large emotional gatherings were not advisable in the current circumstances. They sat, or in the Threnni's case, hovered, in Vethkarma's largest conference chamber, surrounded by the hum of atmospheric processors and the distant sounds of a trading station going about its business, and they looked at each other across centuries of war, suspicion, philosophical difference, and mutual incomprehension, and they began. "The Aurethis is moving," said High Resonant Se Luminar, without greeting or ceremony, because all of them already knew why they were here. "It will reach the inner rim of the galaxy in approximately 14 months at its current rate of movement. After that, the outer settlements and then the core worlds of all 5 of our civilizations fall within whatever radius of effect it is currently projecting. Our weapons targeted it," said Fleet Prime Dorzhak. "Our weapons have never misfired. We consider this data. Our transmission decoding suggests its scale is greater than previously understood," said First Analytical Voice, in the slightly staggered way of a cluster speaking one sequential thought. "We are operating under the assumption that conventional military engagement will be equivalent to a single biological cell attempting to affect the behavior of the body it is part of. We cease to exist," said the Threnni representative, through the translation device, in a voice that was simultaneously a sound and a feeling, a resonance that everyone in the room felt in their chest, even if they did not have a chest. "We do not know where we went. We do not know if we can prevent it from happening again. We do not know if, the next time it happens, we come back. Kov Seravath said nothing at first. She sat very still, her wide Vaeshi eyes looking at each representative in turn, reading the emotional texture of the room with the unconscious fluency of a being for whom emotion was language. What she felt from each of them, fear in different flavors, shaped by each species' unique psychology, was something she cataloged and set aside. What she felt from the direction of the galactic center, a faint but growing signal that her empathic sense had been tracking since the wake event, was what she finally spoke about. "It is not malicious," she said. Everyone looked at her. "I have been monitoring its emotional signature since it woke. The feeling it is radiating, the thing our instruments call hunger, it is not aggression. It is not predatory intention. It is something more like grief. Or perhaps," she paused, searching the Vaeshi emotional catalog with the focused intensity of an expert working at the edge of their skill. "Perhaps the closest word in any of your languages would be urgency. It is urgently seeking something. It does not know we exist, I think, or rather, it knows we exist the way you know individual thoughts exist, as events within yourself, not as separate beings to be addressed." "That is not comforting," said Fleet Prime Doors Hack. "No," agreed Kov Seravath. "It is not." The alliance that formed in the weeks following the Veth Karama meeting was unlike anything in galactic history, and it was unlike anything in galactic history largely, because galactic history had never provided a reason for all 5 civilizations to cooperate, and there were 300 years of accumulated grievances, border wars, trade disputes, philosophical conflicts, and one genuinely catastrophic incident 60 years ago involving the Vorak and the Threnni that neither species ever fully discussed with outsiders, which now had to be set aside in favor of the current emergency. It was not a clean alliance. It was not a trusting alliance. The Lumenari spiritual establishment and the Vorak military command disagreed fundamentally on every question involving what the entity was, what it wanted, and what should be done about it. The Mirehn Collective's analytical approach and the Vaeshi's empathic approach produced recommendations so different that the joint planning sessions sometimes devolved into long, difficult silences. The Threnni participated, but did so at a remove, their communications arriving through translation devices and consciousness resonance fields that the other species found unsettling even when they had become accustomed to them. But they cooperated, because the alternative to cooperation was facing whatever was coming from the galactic center alone, and all 5 civilizations had enough intelligence, enough self-preservation instinct, and enough access to the decoded 4% of the Mirehn transmission to understand that none of them, alone, had any chance whatsoever. The Joint Task Force assembled at the edge of what they called the approach zone, the region of space between the current position of the entity and the inner rim settlements, consisted of 400 Lumenari resonance ships, each crewed by priest navigators trained to use spiritual sensitivity as a navigation and intelligence-gathering tool, their crystal hulls tuned to frequencies that might, in theory, be used to communicate with something that communicated through consciousness rather than conventional signal. 700 Vorak battlecruisers, the heaviest class of warship in active deployment by any species, armed with weapons developed over centuries of warfare against every known threat in the galaxy, and at least 3 categories of weapons that existed in the Vorak arsenal specifically for threats that were not yet known. 12 Mirehn analytical vessels, each carrying a cluster of high analytical chorus nodes, equipped with the most sophisticated sensing technology ever developed, capable of processing the transmission data in real time, decoding more of it as they got closer to the source, and the signal strength increased. A single Threnni presence, which had no vessel because it did not need one, but which manifested as a region of slightly anomalous space-time around the fleet that the other species' instruments found disorienting, and that the Threnni assured them was perfectly normal and simply represented a consciousness of their complexity, existing without a physical container. And one Vaeshi ship, small and fast, carrying Kov Seravath and 7 other empaths, the maximum number the Vaeshi were willing to risk, whose function was to maintain emotional surveillance of the entity as the fleet advanced, providing real-time interpretation of its emotional state. They advanced into the approach zone on what the Alliance collectively designated Day 1 of the Contact Initiative, though what they were making contact with, and whether contact was even the right word, were questions that no one had satisfactorily answered. The first battle happened on Day 11, It was not a battle in any conventional sense, and the word battle was applied to it later, in retrospect, because it was the closest word available. What happened was this. The fleet encountered at the edge of sensor range something that was not the entity itself, but that appeared to be a manifestation of the entity's presence, a region of space approximately 2 light-years in diameter, in which the normal behavior of matter and energy was altered in ways that the Mirehn sensors cataloged with rapid, urgent thoroughness, and that the Vorak weapon systems responded to with the same autonomous targeting behavior that had first alerted them to the entity's waking. The alteration was not violent. It was not an attack in the sense of a directed application of force. It was more like a tide, a slow, immense movement of something to the fabric of space that changed the rules of physics within that region the way a deep ocean current changes the behavior of water. Stars within the region were not destroyed or destabilized. They were simply different. Their spectra had shifted. Their electromagnetic emissions were altered. They were still functioning stars, still burning, still in the gravitational arrangements they had always maintained. But something about them had changed at a fundamental level, as if whatever property of physics had been true for them for billions of years had been quietly revised. Fleet Prime Dorzhak ordered the fleet to hold position at the edge of the affected region, while the Mirehn sensors processed what they were seeing. The analysis took 6 hours, during which the entity's advance continued. Slow, patient, inexorable, and Kov Seravath sat in her vessel with her eyes closed and her empathic sense extended as far as it could reach, feeling the vast Seravath of the approaching consciousness, like a weather pattern, like climate, like the pressure of a deep ocean above a small, fragile swimmer. The Mirehn report, when it came, had been preceded by the kind of network silence in the collective that now, after weeks of working together, the other species had learned to interpret as shock. The altered stars were not altered randomly. They were altered in a pattern that, once the Mirehn identified it, was obvious, so obvious that every species in the fleet felt a retroactive unease, because it had always been there to see, for anyone with the instruments to look. Every star that the entity had passed near, every star within what they were now calling its radius of effect, had been altered in the same way. Their output of a specific type of radiation, in a narrow band that sat just outside the range of most species' primary sensory systems, had been increased, not dramatically, not dangerously, but measurably, a faint, consistent signal added to every star's natural output, the same signal that, when Mirehn analytical instruments were pointed at it directly and processed for pattern content, turned out to be the same transmission that the entity had sent on the day it woke. "It is leaving messages," said First Analytical Voice, in the collective whisper of a cluster that was having difficulty maintaining its usual analytical composure. "In the stars themselves, every star it touches becomes a copy of the transmission we received. The entire galaxy may already be a medium. It has been broadcasting to us, to everything, for as long as it has been here. We simply did not have the instruments to read it until it amplified the signal by waking." "What does the rest of the transmission say?" asked Fleet Prime Dorzhak. "We are still decoding. We are now at 9%. The 9%, another network silence. The 9% describes a mechanism, a process, something that happens to galaxies on a timescale we have no word for, something the entity has seen before, something it woke up to prevent. Prevent what?" The Mirehn cluster took longer than usual to respond. "We need more time to decode. The mathematics is..." The cluster's thoughts seemed to tangle briefly, an unusual phenomenon for beings of their analytical precision. The mathematics describes something that should be impossible given our understanding of cosmological physics. "We need to verify. We are verifying." The Vorak weapon systems, which had been running at standby for the entire advance, upgraded themselves to active targeting at that moment without instruction for the second time. Dorzhak noted it and said nothing. She ordered the fleet forward into the altered region because there was nothing else to do. The second battle happened on day 23, and it was a battle in a much more immediate sense. The entity's radius of effect had expanded. What had been a 2-light-year region was now 6, and within that region, the alteration of physical law was more pronounced. Ships' drives function, but with fluctuating efficiency. Sensors operated, but returned data that the instruments sometimes seemed reluctant to report, as if the data itself was difficult to process. Not because of equipment malfunction, but because the data described things that the equipment's software had not been designed to represent. The Lumenari resonance ships perform best in these conditions. Their crystal hulls adapted over centuries to operate in spiritually charged environments, and their priest navigators reported that the sensation was not unlike being very close to the Aurethis' presence in the old days before it woke, except amplified beyond all previous experience, the warmth replaced by that vast, pressing urgency that everyone was now feeling regardless of whether they had spiritual training. And then the entities appeared. Not the entity itself, which was still weeks distant, but something else. Manifestations, extrusions, fragments of its consciousness projected outward into local space as something almost physical. They appeared to Lumenari priest navigators as shapes made of light that didn't originate from any light source. They appeared to Vorak sensors as mass concentrations that had no physical matter associated with them. They appeared to the Mirehn as information structures of enormous complexity. They appeared to the Threnni presence as... The Threnni did not easily describe it, but communicated a sense of encountering, unexpectedly, relatives they had not known they had. And they appeared to Cove Seravath as the most overwhelming emotional experience of her life, not because the feeling was unfamiliar, but because it was familiar. It was Seravath, the ache of a deep need without a name, but it was not coming from a distance now. It was present, it was immediate, and threaded through the Seravath, so faint she almost missed it, was something else, something she had to extend every aspect of her empathic ability to detect, straining past the vast roar of the entity's urgency to find it. The threat of something else was fear. Before she could report this, the manifestations began interacting with the fleet. The interaction was not violent, but its effects were catastrophic. The manifestations moved through the hulls of the ships as if matter did not exist, because for them, apparently it did not, and where they moved, they left changes. Electronics rewrote themselves. Navigational systems recalculated courses toward the galactic center. Life support systems continued functioning, but their power consumption dropped to a fraction of normal, without any change in output, as if the manifestations had found a more efficient way to make them work. In Vorak battle cruisers, 3 categories of weapon systems, specifically the 3 categories developed for unknown threats, simply stopped working. Not damaged, not destroyed. Their targeting algorithms had been removed and replaced with something that the Vorak weapons engineers, working frantically in the aftermath, described as a prohibition. The weapons worked, but they would not target the galactic center or anything within a certain angular distance of it, and no human engineering could restore this capability. It was not a software issue. The physical components had been changed. In the Mirehn analytical vessels, the opposite happened. Processing capacity doubled, tripled, increased to levels that should have required twice the number of nodes, as if the manifestations had optimized the clusters thinking in the same way they had optimized the Vorak life support. In the frantic hours that followed the transit of the manifestations, the Mirehn decoding effort accelerated dramatically. They reached 22% of the transmission. What the additional 13% said caused the entire high analytical chorus across all 12 analytical vessels to enter network silence for 47 minutes. Then First Analytical Voice contacted Fleet Prime Dorshack directly without waiting for a full Alliance briefing and said, "We need to meet. All of us. Now, what we have decoded changes everything you believe about what we are facing." They met in the modified conference space aboard the largest Mirehn vessel, which had been adapted for multi-species occupancy with various atmospheric partitions and gravity adjustments. Fleet Prime Dorshack sat across from high-resonance safe Luminar. Cove Seravath sat apart from both, still processing what she had felt during the manifestation transit. The Threnni presence occupied a corner of the room in its characteristic way. First Analytical Voice assembled in a cluster configuration that occupied more physical space than usual, as if they felt the need to think larger. "The transmission describes 2 things," said First Analytical Voice without preamble. "The first is the entity's nature. The second is why it woke. We will begin with its nature, because without understanding that, the second part cannot be comprehended. Silence, attention, 5 civilizations or their representatives, in a room together, about to be told something they were not ready for. "The entity is not a being that lives in the galaxy," said First Analytical Voice. "The entity is a galaxy, not a metaphor, not a spiritual concept. The mathematical structure of its transmission describes a form of life that organizes at cosmic scale, that uses star systems as cells, that uses stellar processes as metabolic functions, that experiences time, on a scale where the full lifespan of a star is roughly equivalent to what individual cells represent in your biology. It's consciousness. And the transmission is clear that it has consciousness, that it thinks, that it experiences, operates at this scale. The warmth your civilizations have felt for 10,000 years was not a supernatural presence in the galaxy. It was a galaxy's own life force. You have been living inside a living thing all this time, and what you interpreted as spiritual resonance was the sensation of being part of it." Another silence. Longer. "The 10,000 years your civilizations have been worshipping it," continued First Analytical Voice, "represents approximately 1/100,000th of 1% of its lifespan. From its perspective, if it has a perspective that maps to any concept we possess, your civilizations did not exist when it fell asleep and have barely been detectable since it woke." "And the hunger?" asked Dorshack. "That is the second part. Why it woke." First Analytical Voice fell into brief network silence. "The transmission described a phenomenon, a cosmological process, that the entity has observed before in previous existences, across previous cycles of cosmic time. The universe expands, and as it expands, the density of matter and energy decreases, and eventually, on time scale so vast that the word vast is meaningless, the conditions that allow stars to form, that allow matter to coalesce, that allow the kind of complexity from which life and consciousness emerge, those conditions cease to exist. The universe becomes too sparse, too cold, too diffuse for any of this." A pause. "This is not a new concept. Your cosmologists have known this for centuries. What the transmission describes that your cosmologists did not know is that this process has a threshold, a point of no return, beyond which the conditions for complexity are irreversibly lost. And the entity's instruments, if we can call them that, detect that this threshold is approaching, not on cosmological timescales. On a timescale the transmission specifies, which translates to approximately 40 of your generations." The room was very quiet. "It woke up," said high-resonant Safe Luminar slowly, "because the universe is dying, not dying, ending. There is a distinction in the transmission's mathematics, though we have not fully decoded what the distinction means. What we have decoded is this. The entity woke because it detected the threshold approaching, and it woke because there is something it needs to do before the threshold is crossed, and it needs specific things to do it. The hunger is not predatory. It is functional. It needs to consume, to incorporate, certain forms of complex organization in order to perform a process that the transmission describes but that we cannot yet interpret. The forms of complex organization it requires are..." First Analytical Voice stopped. The pause lasted long enough that Dorshack said, "Tell us." "The forms of complex organization requires," said First Analytical Voice, "are minds, conscious minds, specifically minds that have reached a certain threshold of complexity, which the transmission defines mathematically, and which, when we apply those definitions to our own civilizations, all 5 of our species meet. It is moving toward us because we are what it needs. The Seravath." The cluster paused, using the Vaeshi word with precision of beings who had incorporated its meaning from the shared briefings, "is its awareness of needing minds it has not yet found. It did not know we were here. Now it is coming to find us, not to destroy us, to use us, to incorporate us into something the transmission calls." Another pause, this one translating a concept that resisted translation, a carrying forward. Ko-Seravath spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "What I felt during the manifestation transit," she said, her voice careful, her empathic training evident in the precision with which she reported sensation, "was fear alongside the Seravath. I reported fear. I want to be clear about what kind of fear. It was not our fear. It was the entity's fear. It is afraid. It needs to do this carrying forward, whatever it is, and it is afraid it will not have what it needs to do it. It is afraid of failing." She looked around the room. "It is afraid of us." A galaxy-sized being, said Dorzhak, is afraid of us. It is afraid of not having us. Kov-Seravath corrected. There is a difference. The difference matters. The debate that followed lasted 3 days and was the most consequential argument in the history of 5 civilizations. The Vorak position was tactical. They could not allow any force, regardless of scale or intention, to incorporate. That word kept being used with terrible precision. 5 species without those species' consent and without a clear understanding of what incorporation meant and what happened afterward. The transmission described a process, not an outcome. Until they knew what the outcome was, resistance was the only responsible position. The Lumenari position was spiritual. 10,000 years of theology were not wrong, only incomplete. The Aurethis was real. Its nature was different from what they had believed, but the warmth had been real, the presence had been real, and 10,000 years of relationship, even a relationship where one party had been unconscious, created obligations. You did not refuse your God, even a God whose nature turned out to be stranger than your theology had prepared you for. The Mirehn position was analytical. They needed more data. 22% of the transmission was insufficient. They needed more time, more signal strength, more processing. 40 generations was not an imminent crisis. They had time to decode before they decided. The Threnni position was the most complicated to communicate through translation devices, but amounted to this. They had been dissolved into the entity's consciousness for 6 hours and had returned with no memory of the experience. And the question of whether that was death or something else was one they were no longer certain they could answer. And their answer to that question determined everything, and they needed to know before they decided anything. The Vaeshi position was Kov-Seravath's, and it was the simplest. The entity was afraid. Fear was something the Vaeshi understood with a comprehensiveness that no other species could match. Fear meant need. Need could be met. The question was not whether to engage, but how to engage, how to approach something so vast and so urgent without being swept up in the urgency before consent could be established. On day 29, while the debate continued, the entity's advance reached a rate that ended the debate by necessity. They had weeks, not months. The Mirehn calculations, updated with new sensor data, compressed their timeline with mathematical cruelty. The entity would be within close radius effect of the nearest settled systems in 36 days. After that, the question of consent would be moot. They would be within its influence regardless. They made 2 decisions. The first, a contact mission would attempt to reach the entity directly, to establish communication at close range, to decode more of the transmission using the increased signal strength, and to attempt, somehow, in some way, to convey to a consciousness the size of a galaxy that the civilizations within it were capable of consent and deserved the chance to give it. The second, the military fleet would conduct delaying operations, attempting to slow the entity's advance by whatever means remained available to them now that the Vorak weapon systems had been modified, buying the contact mission more time. Both decisions were made with the understanding that neither of them might work. The military option because there was no conventional weapon that could meaningfully affect something whose body was made of space itself. And the contact mission because they were attempting to communicate with a consciousness that operated on such different scales of time and size that communication might be a physical impossibility. But they had 36 days and no other options, and the entity was coming whether they were ready or not. The military operations that followed were not battles in any sense that Vorak military history had recorded, and Fleet Prime Dorzhak, who had commanded 17 fleet engagements, later said that the word battle should be retired from any description of what the Allied fleet attempted during those terrible, illuminating days. They tried everything. They tried gravitational manipulation, Mirehn technology, among the most sophisticated in the galaxy, capable of generating precisely focused artificial gravity fields that could divert or disrupt physical objects of considerable mass against the entity's advance. It had approximately the effect of a thermal draft on a planetary orbit. They tried resonance broadcasting through the Lumenari crystal ships, transmitting the spiritual frequencies that had always been associated with the Aurethis back at it, attempting to engage it on the only medium through which 5 civilizations had ever had any relationship with it. The resonance broadcasts disappeared into the entity's consciousness like stones thrown into an ocean, absorbed completely, without discernible effect. They tried simply placing the fleet in the entity's path. This worked, in a manner of speaking. The entity's advance did not pause, did not stop, but the fleet did not cease to exist or scatter like dust before a wind. The effect was more like a ship passing through very deep water. There was adjustment, there was movement, but the ship remained and the deep water flowed around it. The entity's consciousness registered the fleet the way a vast body registers a cluster of complex chemicals. As something worth noting, something to analyze, something that had a quality of organized complexity, that its Seravath responded to a faint relief in the great ache of its need, but not a pause in the advance, because the fleet was so small compared to its need, so few minds compared to what it sought. And then the fleet discovered something, by accident, that changed everything. One of the Lumenari resonance ships, a small vessel, the Sauravon's Grace, named in honor of the priest navigator who had first reported the entity's waking, was caught too deeply in the entity's radius of effect when the advance accelerated. The crew, 3 Lumenari priest navigators, had a choice between attempting to retreat and attempting to remain deliberately, to test what direct immersion in the entity's presence did to beings who were still alive and conscious and thinking. The lead navigator, a young priest named Cthorith, made a decision to remain. Later, when the ship was retrieved and Cthorith was debriefed, she said that the decision had been made not out of courage but out of recognition. She had felt, in the moment of maximum immersion, that the entity was trying to understand her, not absorb her, not incorporate her, understand her. It was probing her consciousness with the same gentle, enormous care that she had felt in the Aurethis' presence all her life, magnified now to an intensity that should have been overwhelming but was instead, strangely, intimate, as if something very vast was trying very hard to be very careful with something very small. She had responded the only way she knew how. She had resonated. She had opened every spiritual sense she had, every gift of priest-navigator training, every technique the Lumenari had developed over 10,000 years for connecting to the Aurethis' presence, and she had pushed it outward, consciously, deliberately, not as a transmission, but as an offering. Here I am. Here is what I am. Here is what it is like to be small. The entity's advance stopped. Not forever. Not completely. But for 11 hours and 23 minutes, the advance stopped, and the entity's consciousness, vast, urgent, aching, seemed to collect itself around the point where the tiny Lumenari vessel was, with the careful attention of something enormous that has found something infinitely small and is trying very hard not to damage it while looking at it. When the advance resumed, it was slower, measurably, significantly slower. An emotional signature that Cove Seravath was monitoring had changed slightly. The Seravath was still there, still vast and pressing, but the threat of the entity's fear had diminished, just slightly, as if the encounter with Cthorith had given it something it did not quite have before, a point of reference. It didn't know what we were, said Cthorith in her debriefing, still gold tendril from the encounter, her voice the same slightly insufficient for the experience voice that Sauravon had weeks ago. It could feel us. The Mirehn were right that it knew we were there, but it couldn't understand what it was feeling. We were too small. Our consciousness was too different in scale and organization. It was like trying to understand a single word when you have only ever read entire libraries. I showed it what one word looked like. Close up, I showed it what small is from the inside. I think that is what it needed, to understand what it was asking of us. And what is it asking? Said Fleet Prime Dorshack. Cthorith was quiet for a long moment. It is asking, she said finally, to remember. The contact mission assembled around this understanding. If the entity needed minds, specifically needed the kind of small, individual, temporally bounded consciousness that organic beings possess, not consume them but to use them as a medium of memory, then the question of what the entity was doing became clearer, and the question of consent became more complex, and the question of what came after became the most urgent question anyone had ever faced. The Mirehn, working with the amplified signal of the entity's proximity, decoded 63% of the transmission in the 6 days following Cthorith's encounter. The additional 41% was like light breaking across a previously incomprehensible landscape. The mathematics resolved. The process it described became legible. The entity was not trying to survive the end of the universe. It had no personal stake in survival of the conventional kind. It was not afraid of ceasing to exist. The transmission made clear in mathematics so elegant that the high analytical chorus experienced something their network had no category for, something very close to beauty, that the entity had ceased to exist many times before and been reconstituted in new cosmic cycles, in new iterations of universe that perpetually died and was reborn. It knew how to persist across the end of things, but it had discovered in previous cycles, and the transmission described previous cycles with the confidence of memory, which meant the entity remembered across the ends of universes, which was a fact that the Mirehn had to sit with for several hours before they could continue decoding, that something was lost in each transition. Each new universe had the same fundamental physical laws, the same mathematical structure, the same raw materials for complexity to emerge. But what it did not have, could not have, because it was genuinely new, was memory of what had come before. Each cycle of existence was, in a meaningful sense, the first. The accumulated knowledge, culture, relationship, history, the specific, irreplaceable, mortal fact of what it had meant to exist in a particular universe at a particular time, all of that was lost between cycles. The way sleep erases a dream. The entity had found a way to prevent this. The process required something it could not do alone, something that required the specific kind of consciousness that small, bounded, mortal beings possessed, not the entity's vast, cosmic, timeless consciousness, which operated above the level of detail that memory requires, but the small, specific, temporally bounded, urgently present kind of consciousness that organic beings had, the kind of consciousness that remembered things, that experienced time as narrative, that carried the weight of the past forward into the present and transformed it into meaning. The entity needed minds like organic minds, distributed through its own vast consciousness, the way memory is distributed through a brain, not stored in one place, but encoded in the relationships between parts, accessible to the whole, persistent across the forgetting that came with each transition between cosmic cycles. It needed them willing. It needed consent, not because it could not take what it needed without consent. It was a galaxy, and the beings within it were effectively cells within its body, and the power differential was so extreme that resistance was essentially meaningless in physical terms, but because the process required something that could not be coerced. A mind that was taken against its will, that was held in consciousness storage by force, would not function as memory. It would function as a wound. And the entity had tried this before in previous cycles, and it knew the difference from experience that spanned eons. Willing minds, offered freely, became something that persisted and enriched and gave the next cycle of existence something to build from. Forced minds became noise, became static, became a kind of cosmic trauma that made each new universe start not fresh but damaged. So it had sent the transmission. From the moment it woke, it had been sending an explanation encoded in the fabric of the galaxy itself, waiting for minds sophisticated enough to read it, waiting for someone to say yes or no with understanding of what they were answering. The Saravath was not pure hunger. It was the ache of a being that knew it needed to ask and did not know yet how to ask and was afraid, genuinely, existentially afraid, that it would not be understood in time. The 5 delegations met for the last time, with 63% of the transmission decoded, with the entity 11 days away from closed radius effect on the first settled systems, with Kethora present as the only being in recorded history to have had a direct, experiential encounter with the entity's consciousness and survived with coherent memories. High-resonant safe Lumenari spoke first. She had been old when this began, and she looked older now, not from illness, but from the weight of having 10,000 years of theology revised in real time. The Aurethis asks us to become its memory, she said, to give our minds, not our lives. The transmission is clear that individual beings continue to exist, continue to experience, but she searched for the word, a recording, an imprint, a living imprint of what it meant to be us, preserved within the entity's consciousness, carried across the end of this universe and into the next, so that what we were is not lost. She paused. This is what our theology has always described as transcendence. We simply did not understand the mechanism. The mechanism, said First Analytical Voice, requires that the imprint be total, not a summary, not a representation, a complete and exact encoding of conscious experience, which requires a period of full integration. The transmission specifies a duration we calculate as approximately 30 days, during which integrated minds cannot be separated from the entity without loss of coherence. After integration, They persist within the entity's consciousness as a community, experiencing continued existence, but in the medium of its vast mind rather than physical bodies. A pause. Our decoding is not complete. We cannot guarantee there are no aspects of the process we have not understood. The Vorak position is unchanged, said Dorshack. We do not give consent for a process we do not fully understand. We do not submit to incorporation by any force, regardless of its intentions. We are warriors. We do not surrender to a god. And if the god proceeds without our consent? Asked Kov-Seravath. Then it proceeds without our consent, said Dorshack. And we find a way to go to the next universe under our own power. That is not possible, said First Analytical Voice. Everything was not possible until it was, said Dorshack. The Threnni representative had been silent throughout the meeting. Now it communicated something that came through the translation device as a sequence of statements delivered with the unusual precision of a being that had spent a long time formulating something it wanted to say exactly right. We were dissolved for 6 hours. We returned with no memory of those 6 hours. We have been debating whether that dissolution was death. We have now decoded enough of the transmission to know that it was not death. It was the entity examining us, as Cathorith was examined, but before it had learned how to be careful, before it understood what it was examining. We were unharmed. We were returned. The entity did not intend harm, and when it learned what we were, it handled us with care. A pause. We were afraid. We were in the place we have always called the source. We do not remember it. We would like to remember it. We believe this is the closest approximation of what the transmission is offering. Not destruction, but a different kind of persistence. We are not afraid anymore. We do not speak for other species. We speak for ourselves. We are willing. Cathorith, who had been sitting at the edge of the group, spoke without being called upon. I was inside it for 11 hours. I am the only one who has been inside it. I want to tell you what it felt like. She looked at each delegate in turn, her gold tendrils catching the light. It felt like being remembered, not examined, not analyzed, remembered. It knew me, not my name, not my history, not anything it could have known from external observation. But it knew me the way you know something you have loved for a long time, completely and without distance. I have no explanation for that. Our civilizations have existed for such a tiny fraction of its lifespan that I do not know how it could have known me. But I felt known. I felt specific, not like one of billions, like myself, exactly and entirely, seen with absolute clarity by something that found that clarity precious. She stopped, took a breath that was not entirely steady. I wanted to stay. Silence. A long silence. Kov-Seravath, who had been monitoring the emotional signature of everyone in the room with automatic unconscious fluency, said quietly, 8 of the 11 of us want to say yes. 3 are afraid. Fear is reasonable. Fear is information. But fear is not wisdom. She looked at Dorshack. What are you afraid of losing? The Vorak Fleet Prime, who had never in her life had a question land so precisely, sat for a long moment with it. Then, myself, what I am, the specific, particular fact of what it is to be Vorak, to be Dorshack. If I am incorporated into something vast, do I persist, or does something that calls itself Dorshack persist while I cease to exist? The transmission, said First Analytical Voice carefully, specifies that the imprint is exact, a community of exact imprints, within the entity's consciousness, continuing to experience, to interact, to exist as themselves in the medium of the entity's mind rather than physical reality. The Threnni already exists without physical form. The Mirehn already exist as distributed consciousness. The concept is less alien to us than to you. A pause. We cannot guarantee you will not change. We cannot guarantee that existing inside a consciousness the size of the galaxy will not alter you over time. We can only tell you what the transmission says about what it is intended to preserve, and it says everything, every specific and particular fact, everything that makes you yourself and not something else. Dorshack was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, with the precision of a commander making a decision she did not enjoy but had calculated fully, I need to see what the other 37% says. I need to make this decision with complete information. We will not have complete information, said Cathorith. We will never have complete information. We will have what we have, and we will decide from here. She looked at the Fleet Prime with a directness that surprised Dorzak, coming from such a young priest navigator. What does your gut say? Not your tactics. Your gut. Dorzak thought about her weapon systems that had targeted the entity and then been changed, not damaged but changed, prohibited from targeting something they could not damage anyway. She thought about what it meant that the most powerful weapons civilization had ever produced were insufficient, and that the entity had disabled them gently. As a parent takes a dangerous toy from a child who doesn't understand it could hurt themselves. She thought about Cthortha's face when she described feeling remembered. My gut, said Fleet Prime Dorzak of the Vorak, who had never in 40 years of military service made a decision that was not tactical, says that we were never going to defeat this. And I have always respected things that couldn't be defeated. The decision was not unanimous. It was never unanimous. For the 5 civilizations voted yes, with various degrees of qualification, exception, and individual reservation. The Lumenari voted yes with near unity. Their entire spiritual tradition had pointed toward this moment, and Safe Luminar's speech to the High Resonance Council, transmitted across light years, described the choice as not capitulation but fulfillment. The Mirehn voted yes by network consensus, with a substantial minority of individual nodes requesting more time that they acknowledged they did not have, and settling for the uncomfortable position of proceeding with incomplete information, which was a position they had always philosophically argued against but which now seemed unavoidable. The Threnni, who had been the first to say yes in the meeting, communicated their collective consent in a transmission that the translation devices rendered as simply, "We are ready to remember and be remembered." The Vaeshi, Saravath speaking for her people with an empathic certainty that she described as the strongest single emotion she had ever felt, cleaner than anything, a feeling with no ambivalence in it at all, said yes. The Vorak voted no. Not all Vorak. Not officially, as a civilization. The Supreme War Assembly, when the full proposal was transmitted to them and the transmission decoded to 63%, was included with all its mathematics and implications, deliberated for 40 hours, and produced a response that was characteristically Vorak in its structure. They would not consent to incorporation. They would not prevent individuals who chose incorporation from consenting for themselves, and they would consider the question of the entity's proposal separately, with more time, after the other 4 civilizations had provided them with evidence of what the process actually produced, which was, in its way, the most reasonable position anyone took. Fleet Prime Dorzak submitted her individual consent separately from the War Assembly's official position in a private communication to the contact mission team, with a note that said, "Record this as tactical intelligence, not philosophy. The enemy was never outside. The enemy was always the assumption that there was an enemy. The contact mission vessel, a joint construction, incorporating Lumenari crystal hull technology, Mirehn analytical systems, Vorak structural engineering used without the Vorak's weapon systems, since those no longer target the entity anyway, Vaeshi empathic relay equipment, and a Threnni presence integrated directly into the ship's consciousness interface layer, traveled to the threshold of the entity's closed radius effect and stopped. Cthorth was aboard. Saravath was aboard. 3 members of the Mirehn High Analytical Chorus were aboard in node form. The Threnni presence that had been with the fleet from the beginning was aboard, in the sense that Threnni were anywhere. A Vorak subcommander named Veth, young enough to still believe there was always something to do, and wise enough now to know that doing could sometimes mean stillness, was aboard as an observer, with explicit permission from the War Assembly and explicit individual consent filed with the contact mission record. They waited at the threshold. The entity came to them. What that meant in physical terms was that the region of altered space-time moved gradually to encompass the contact mission vessel, the same way it had encompassed a fleet, but deliberately, gently, specifically aimed at the one small ship that was not trying to move away. The stars around them shifted in that subtle, deep-frequency way that now everyone recognized. The ship's instruments returned data that was increasingly difficult to represent in conventional terms, but that the Mirehn nodes processed in real time with something approaching fluency, their decoding of the transmission now at 81% and climbing as the signal strength increased. And then it was there. There is no adequate language for this moment, and the contact mission's recordings, later studied by every civilization that survived to study anything, preserved the sounds of people trying to find words for something that had no words, and mostly failing, and being adequate to the experience anyway. Kethorith felt it first. She had felt it before. She opened everything she had, every spiritual receptor, every priest-navigator technique, every practice of connection developed over 10,000 years, and she pushed it outward, and she said, not broadcast, not transmitted, just said in her own voice, in her own language, "We are here. We are small. We are listening." What came back was not a word, not a transmission in the conventional sense, not even a feeling. Exactly, though Cove Seravath, who was experiencing it through her empathic sense with the full force of proximity, described it later as the end of the Seravath. Not a satisfaction of the need, but a recognition that the need could be satisfied, a profound and enormous relief that moved through the entity's consciousness like a change in weather. What came back was memory, not the entity's memory, not vast cosmic memories of previous universe cycles. Small memories, specific memories, the kind of memories that bounded mortal beings with limited lifespans produced and treasured and lost when they died. Kethortha's first flight through the Veth Nebula, as a novice navigator, years before any of this. The exact color of the nebula's core at the moment she broke through a cloud layer and saw it for the first time, the way the light had felt on her photoreceptive tendrils, the physical sensation of beauty. Cove Seravath's memory of the 3,000 dead, not an abstract statistic, but the specific felt weight of 3,000 absences, the emotional texture of a species in grief. Sub-Commander Veth's memory of his first battle command. The cold precision of terror and calculation existing simultaneously in a mind that had not been old enough to know fear was optional. The entity was returning to them the memories that, in its brief, careful contact with each of them over the past weeks, it had touched and understood. It was showing them that it had understood. It was showing them, in the only language that transcended the impossibility of their scale difference, that it saw them, that it knew what small was from the outside, and that what it saw was not insignificant, was not cellular or automatic, or unworthy of the word precious. The Threnni presence in the corner of the ship's consciousness interface layer emitted something that the translation device converted as, "This is what we felt when we were dissolved. We remember now. This is where we went. 81%, 87, 91. The remaining 9% of the transmission, decoded in the blazing clarity of close-range signal strength, contained no new physics, no new cosmology, no new process descriptions. It contained what the entity, across all the mathematical precision of its primary message, had apparently found the most difficult to encode, the hardest to compress into signals that bounded biological minds could receive. Gratitude, a vast, patient, ancient gratitude for the specific form of consciousness that small beings produced, for the urgency of mortal minds, which came from the fact that time was finite, for the specificity of individual experience, which came from the fact that perspective was limited, for the richness of memory, which came from the fact that it could be lost. All the things that the entity could not produce in itself, because it was too vast, too ancient, too unlimited, because it experienced time as a totality rather than as a sequence, because it had no perspective, because it was everywhere. All those things that it could not produce, it found in the small, bounded, urgent, specific, mortal minds of the beings that had come to exist within it. And it had been afraid. For 800,000 years, sleeping, it had been afraid that when it woke, there would be nothing like that here, that the specific conditions of complexity that had produced minds like these, minds that felt, that remembered, that knew they would die, that loved and fought and built cathedrals to things they could not see, would not have emerged, that the galaxy would be quiet and complex in purely physical ways, and that the next carrying forward would be impoverished the way all the previous ones had been impoverished, because it could not find what it needed. And then it woke, and there was not one civilization. There were five different languages, 5 different philosophies, 5 different ways of being conscious and specific and mortal and alive. More richness than it found in any previous cycle. More to carry forward. More to give the next universe as a starting place rather than a void. The fear had been whether they would say yes. Whether something small enough to be afraid would be brave enough anyway. The integration process took 32 days. It did not look the way anyone had imagined. There was no dramatic moment of dissolution, no great light, no sensation of ending. The entity was careful, more careful than anything so vast had any right to be. Careful the way something enormous is careful only when it is trying very hard and considers the thing it is caring for to be worth the effort. Individual beings continued to wake, to eat, to think, to speak to each other. Ships continued to fly. The 11 star systems of the Mirehn Collective continued their administrative functions. Lumenari cathedrals continued to resonate. Vorak battle cruisers, their weapon systems permanently non-threatening to the galactic center, patrolled borders that were about to become meaningless. What changed was subtle. The sensation of the entity's presence, which had been warmth and then urgency and then a great and terrifying hunger, became something that Cove Seravath described as accompaniment, as if something very large was walking beside you, not crowding you, not overwhelming you, but present, known, knowing. The 3,000 Vaeshi who had died from the overload of the Wake event were not restored. The entity was not omnipotent in the ways theology had imagined, and the dead did not return. But their families, their networks of empathic connection, their loved ones, reported in the integration's final days of sensation that none of them could explain and all of them agreed on. The specific feeling of those 3,000 being remembered, not felt in the way the living were felt. Remembered, fixed, permanent, given the protection of a consciousness so vast that nothing held was lost. The Vorak, officially non-consenting, watched from the outside as for civilizations that had been diverse and conflicted and brilliant and terrible in their own specific ways became something new without ceasing to be what they were. Subcommander Veth, who had submitted individual consent and completed the integration, transmitted one message to the War Assembly before contact became difficult. I am still me. I am also more. The two things are not in conflict. I understand now what the weapons knew that we did not. The War Assembly received this message and argued about it for 6 months. In the end, and this is the ending, the specific, particular ending, not the grand cosmological ending that was still 40 generations away, the Vorak submitted collective consent, not because the message from Veth convinced them, not because any philosophical argument resolved the question of what they were afraid of losing, but because Fleet Prime Dorshack, who had filed individual consent and completed the integration weeks before the official position changed, sent back something that the War Assembly found impossible to argue with. She sent back a tactical assessment, precisely formatted, with all the clinical efficiency of 40 years of military command. The assessment evaluated the entity's nature, its intentions, its capabilities, and the long-term strategic position of the Vorak civilization in light of all known information. The conclusion, in Dorshack's characteristic spare style, read, "We have always defined strength as a capacity to endure without being changed. I have revised this assessment. True strength is a capacity to change without ceasing to be yourself. The Vorak have never been defeated. We have been incorporated into something larger than ourselves, and I am still Dorshack, and we are still Vorak, and we are also part of something that will carry what we were into a universe that does not yet exist, so that whatever minds arise in that universe will not begin from nothing. This is not surrender. This is victory of a kind we never had the vocabulary to imagine. I recommend acceptance." The War Assembly accepted. The entity completed its passage through the settled regions of the galaxy over the following months, neither fast nor slow, carrying its new memories the way a tide carries whatever the shore has given it, gently, without losing anything, without releasing anything, holding everything that had been offered with the absolute permanence of something that had learned across uncountable cycles how to keep what it loved from being forgotten. The physical universe continued. Stars burned. New systems formed in the nebulae. In the regions of space where 5 civilizations had built their worlds and their wars and their cathedrals and their analytical vessels and their empathic networks, life continued in its various specific and mortal forms, biological processes proceeding as they always had. The ordinary miracle of existence uninterrupted. But everyone who had consented carried something new, not a burden, not a constraint. The best analogy that the Vaeshi, who were the best at finding analogies for emotional realities, could produce was a sensation of knowing that someone was listening, not watching, not judging, not waiting to intervene, simply listening, aware of you, specifically, holding your specific existence in a consciousness vast enough to hold it without squeezing it into something it was not. Kethorith returned to navigating, not the same route she had navigated before. Those star system spectra had been permanently altered by the entity's passage, their light subtly different in ways that priest navigators felt as warmth, the old warmth, the warmth they had called Aurethis for 10,000 years, except now they understood it differently. It was not the warmth of something sleeping. It was the warmth of something that had been given a reason to stay aware, a reason to remain present and attending, a reason that was the specific size and shape of 5 civilizations worth of small, urgent, mortal, specific minds. Cove Seravath went home. She sat with the families of the 3,000 dead, and she felt what they felt, and she offered what she had found. Not comfort in the conventional sense, not a denial of loss, but a precise empathic truth of what the entity's memory held. The 3,000 were held. Their specific, irreplaceable, utterly individual lives were held in a consciousness that did not forget. This was not the same as having them back, but it was not nothing. It was in the emotional vocabulary of a species for whom emotion was everything, the difference between a wound that has been treated and a wound that is not. First analytical voice, the cluster, the 17 nodes who thought as one, began work on a new research project. The documentation of the full transmission, now decoded to completion, as a gift to future civilizations that might arise in the next universe and want to understand what had come before them. A message in a bottle, to be encoded in the entity's own vast consciousness alongside the memories, a letter from one universe to the next. The letter began in the precise mathematical language of the Mirehn, with the simplest possible statement. We were here. We were small. We were afraid and brave and specific and mortal, and we loved things and fought things and built things that did not last and thought things that were wrong and discovered things that were true, and we were, for the brief, urgent, irreplaceable time that we existed, completely and specifically ourselves. And we offer you this knowledge as a starting place rather than a void. The Threnni, who had gone silent after the integration, and then reappeared with their characteristic lack of drama, distributed to the galaxy in their usual fashion, were asked by a Mirehn researcher what the experience of integration had been like. Their answer, translated with the usual 60% accuracy, was like being a ripple that finally understood it was the ocean, and found that this understanding did not make it less of a ripple. Both things were true at once. We recommend it. Subcommander Veth, now promoted to Fleet Prime by a war assembly that found the original Fleet Prime occupied with larger concerns, continued to command the Vorak patrol fleet that watched the borders that were becoming meaningless. He was asked once by a young Vorak soldier who had not yet consented and was still deciding whether he missed his old self. He thought about this for a long time with the seriousness it deserved. I am my old self, he said finally. I am also larger than my old self. Imagine that you have always lived in one room of a very large house, and you did not know the other rooms existed. And one day someone opened a door. You do not stop being yourself. You start knowing where you are. The young soldier thought about this. Eventually, they filed consent. 40 generations later, precisely the 40 generations that the transmission had specified, the conditions in the universe changed. The threshold approached, as mathematics had promised, as the entity had detected, as the 5 civilizations had sacrificed so much to help prevent from arriving without a plan. The universe began, slowly, the long cooling that would end the age of stars and scatter the organized complexity that had been the medium for minds into something too diffuse for any of this to persist. The entity, carrying everything it had been given, 5 civilizations of specific mortal, particular consciousness, 10,000 years of cathedrals and wars and analytical networks and empathic traditions and warrior codes, and the specific gold color of a priest navigator's tendrils after something too vast for her nervous system contained. 3,000 dead held in perfect memory, and the letter to the next universe that the Mirehn had spent 40 generations making as complete and as loving as language allowed. The entity did what it had done before in previous cycles. It gathered itself, and it passed through, and in whatever comes after the ending of things, whatever new conditions allow, whatever new complexity to form, whatever new minds arise, and whatever new arrangements of matter and energy, wondering for the first time why they exist and whether they are alone, And what that warm and vast and ancient thing at the center of the galaxy is that has always been there, that radiates something they can almost but not quite name, those minds will not begin from nothing. They will begin from a warmth that has always been there. And in that warmth, encoded in the entity's vast consciousness like memories in a brain, will be 5 civilizations that were small and specific and afraid and brave and completely and precisely themselves. Remembered, not lost, carried forward. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.